Well, I'm standing here where it all began. My name is Sammy Harris, lead minister for Leesburg Christian Church, and I'm in the front yard of the old building, the 1888 building. However, that's not the original structure that was here when the church actually began. Well, you may not know that at one time, Leesburg was a hustling, bustling community, one of the largest in the area. A gentleman by the name of W.E. Boswell came here from Virginia, London County, Virginia, and founded this whole region. And so from here to Connersville to Oxford in Scott County, he owned all the property here. He laid out a whole village in which he planned to develop into a major metropolitan area for the day. Tan yards, blacksmiths, 4 factories, a hemp factory, cotton factory. There were all kinds of things going on here. They had one of the only banks in the area, dentists, doctors. It was a thriving community. And of course, when you have a thriving community, you need to have a thriving church. In 1828, some of the people that lived in the community got together and decided that they needed to have a church. And so they invited a well-known restoration forefather by the name of Barton W. Stone to come here to this property, approximately where I'm standing, and actually preach the very first sermon under an old plum tree here on the corner of the property. But that's not really where the church roots began. Yes, it's true, that was in 1828, but see, 25 years earlier plus, there was another event that took place, and I'm going to tell you about that first. Well, here we are in Cane Ridge, Kentucky. It had its namesake given by our frontiersman Daniel Boone himself. It's because of all the cane that used to grow in this area for many years, which there's only a few patches on the property now. But an amazing event happened here in August of 1801. Barton W. Stone, who is buried directly behind me with a white tombstone, was the minister here. He was a Presbyterian minister, and this was a Presbyterian church. The church that you see behind me is actually, that's just the shrine. The church itself is actually underneath the shrine and protected. I really want to encourage you, if you've never made your way here, about 6 miles from Paris, Kentucky, you would be in for a real treat. So bring your family and friends and come over and hang out sometime. They have a great museum, a curator on the property, and he'll be happy to show you around. But in that summer of 1801, something very, very special happened. Barton W. Stone, who had been the minister here for some time, came under the conviction from seeing other meetings that he wanted to bring denominations in the area together in one family camp type meeting. Therefore, he sent out invitations over several months, and of course you have to keep in mind in 1801, that was only about 25 years after our country's independence as a nation. So he sent out invitations all around the surrounding area, and sure enough, more people than he ever expected showed up for this family camp meeting. Ministers and congregations alike traveled miles to be on this property. As many as 20,000 people actually camped on this piece of land for about 6 to 10 days. During that time, many ministers were here from various denominations, mostly Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians. And during that time, they had set hours in which they had particular worship services. And the whole idea and focus originally was to bring everyone together for an incredible communion service. However, during that period of time, also preaching took place all over the property around me. Ministers stood on stumps, on wagons. Thousands of people gathered here for this incredible event that we know as the launch of the Restoration Movement. From this event, a lot of things happened. Almost every church, not only in Kentucky, but in the whole United States, from the Christian church movement, launched from this point forward. To give you an idea of how important that is, more than 2.5 million people now claim to be a part of the independent Christian church in the United States. What happened here was so dramatic that it has lasting effect all these years later. You see, these guys got together and decided that denominationalism had its problems, that people had been holding on to man-made creeds and doctrines and hierarchy of church government for way too long. So they decided to push aside the names that had been given them and go back to Scripture and just call themselves Christians. And from this meeting, several slogans developed, like no name but the divine name, no book but the Bible, no creed but Christ. in matters of doctrine, unity, in matters of opinion, liberty, but in all things, love. Those were the types of slogans that came out of this great meeting that took place here. Now, the reason why this location is so critical and why I want to talk about it with regard to Leesburg, because it was Barton W. Stone, the minister of this church, who launched this great movement here in Cane Ridge, that actually was the very first speaker to begin Leesburg Christian Church in Leesburg, Kentucky. I'm standing in the foyer or the lobby area of what we call our worship center. This worship center was built in 2011 with the very first worship service taking place in Christmas of that year, at which time we had over 1,100 people come to the dedicatory service that particular Christmas. Well, it's hard to believe that 10 plus years have passed since this building was built, but this wasn't the first building, of course, and I want to share with you a little bit about the history of Leesburg Christian Church. The original ministry here, of course, began in, as I've already alluded to, in 1826, following the Restoration meeting that took place over in Cane Ridge. But the first building that was actually built here was built in 1833. The ministry had been meeting in a house adjacent to this property for a number of years, owned and operated by a local person in the community who saw the need for a ministry to take place and actually ended up deeding this original piece of property over for the first church to be built in 1833. That church served as the original sanctuary, and it was a brick structure. It had a slope floor, not so much unlike what we built and are worshiping in today. That building, however, only served the congregation for about 54 years, and tradition holds that it burned in what was known as the Great Fire of Leesburg, which actually took many of the buildings and facilities down at that particular time. One of our former members, Martha Barnes, who's a local historian, gathered a lot of this information many years ago, which I am sharing with you today. I want to jump forward just for a moment and tell you about some of the ministry that took place here. It's very interesting. When you go to what we call our original sanctuary now, there are numerous stained glass windows that will immediately catch your eye. On the very front window, there is pictures, of course, depicting Christ and his ministry all throughout, but there is also a dedication made at the bottom of those windows. And one of the dedications is made to a man by the name of John Allen Gano. The reason for that is that he played a critical role in the ministry of this church for a number of years. He was born in Georgetown, here in Kentucky. He was educated in Bourbon County, but he studied under Barton W. Stone, whom we've already alluded to. Barton W. Stone had an institute in Georgetown in which he was training young men for ministry. Well, it was during this time that John Allen Gano actually went to Texas to pursue a law degree, and that's what he did. This was common at the time. Law and ministry often went hand in hand. When he returned from Texas, he set up practice in Scott County here in Kentucky. But then something happened. A transitional point took place in his life. He decided to take a trip down the Ohio River. Along that trip, John Allen Gano became very ill. So much so that he had to get off the boat, and a nearby village took him in and nursed him back to health over an extended period of time. It was through that experience that John Allen decided that he needed to use his gifts and abilities to serve God and serve him only. So when he finally was strong enough to make it back to this area, he reconnected with his mentor, Barton W. Stone. Now, you need to understand that this is critical. Stone, who was the founder of the independent Christian church and restoration movement, has already been discussed, but John Allen Gano came from a staunch Baptist background. You see, his father and his grandfather were Baptist ministers. And his namesake, which was his grandfather, John Allen Gano, was a very, very famous man. He was actually George Washington, the father of our country, our first president. He was George Washington's personal chaplain during the Revolutionary War. He also, it was told that he gave the closing prayer at the conclusion of the Revolutionary War and baptized George Washington in the James River. Gano made a decision. He decided to break away from his family history and tradition of the Baptist Church and began to lean into the Restoration movement and its principles. Principles that became philosophies of the independent Christian church, such as no creed but Christ, no book but the Bible, no name but the divine name. In matters of doctrine, unity, in matters of opinion, liberty, but in all things, love. And then another slogan that was very important: not the only Christians, but Christians only. And so he began to adhere to that idea that we're just Christians, and that should be the name that we should adhere to. So Gano, in short, became really the founding minister of the Leesburg Christian Church, and amazingly served Leesburg for 59 years. I guess that's what you have to do to get your name and your dates on a stained glass window. But it was during his leadership the church really did flourish. Now, during this early time of ministry, John Allen, through his network of friends and connection to Barton W., had a number of famous ministers that came and actually spoke at Leesburg Christian Church. Names like Raccoon John Smith and J.W. McGarvey and Samuel Rogers and Alexander Campbell, men who were very instrumental in founding what we know now as the Independent Christian Church, which is over 3 million strong just in the United States alone. These men were often frequented this area and preached here at Leesburg. Now, you have to understand that in that particular time frame that ministers didn't actually preach at the same church every week. Gano only actually preached here at Leesburg about once a month, because the other weekends he was partnering with Barton W. in planting churches in our area. They planted such churches that are still in existence today, like the Berea Christian Church in Fayette County and the Newtown Christian Church, which is just up the road here from Leesburg, which is part of the Disciples of Christ movement today. Now, ironically, John Allen Gano actually died before the brick structure we call the original sanctuary was complete in 1888. It was in 1877 that he actually passed, and the construction for this building was right then taking place. So let me tell you a little bit about that building that you now get to see every time that you pull onto our property. Upon its completion in 1888, one of the interesting facts of it is that that entire building was built at an estimated cost of $5,000. Every brick was fired on site. It was one of the larger, most prestigious buildings in this particular area. Most of the work was done by locals, and they did an excellent job. I mean, it's still standing 132 plus years later, and we still use it. In our ministry today, it's a very vital part of what we do week to week. It's probably our most used facility, as we have kind of converted it into a multi-use building. Well, in the decades that followed Gano's death, the church went through numerous ministry and ministers. Leesburg's population, due to the fire many allude to, had dwindled over this period of time, while neighboring towns such as Georgetown, Cynthiana, and Paris began to grow, and this became primarily a farming and agricultural-based community. But even so, the church flourished. It wasn't unusual for revivals to be taking place here and church attendance to be between 400 and 500 at a time in a very small, where they would sit outside on the property and have meetings all day. There was even a few occasions where more than 1,000 people would gather according to the speakers and the occasions that they had. But numerous people were won to Christ because of this ministry during this time. Now, since then, the church has seen, of course, a lot of ministers and evangelists come and go through the years. Now, ministers who were very important to this church were also very important to our movement. And the history runs rich and deep. For instance, the Fosters, R.C. Foster and his son Louis Foster, both served here as ministers of Leesburg Christian Church in the early and mid 1900s. Louis Foster, who served here twice in the 40s and in the 50s and became a professor at Cincinnati Bible Seminary, actually was instrumental in translating the New International Version Bible, which many of you, I'm sure, possess or have read all the time. But since that time, there's also been some other famous individuals in our churches and movement. Wayne B. Smith from Southland Christian Church, who's been instrumental in beginning multiple parachurch organizations in our areas, in camps and nursing homes and all kinds of parachurch organizations which are critical today. Palmer Young, who was president of Kentucky Christian University. That's just to name a couple. And that came all the way up through the 90s. But it's interesting that all this time and in this history, up until the 90s, we don't have a lot of specific detail about the ministry of Leesburg, with the exception, we know that the first full-time ministry began in 1977. Up until this time, it had all been part-time. They called a man by the name of Buford Cole. Ironically, I personally, as a 7th grader, got to meet Buford Cole when I visited Kentucky Christian University, and I remember him well because he was a very tall man. He was 6'9". He was a good basketball player from the school, and so he was the first called full-time minister here at Leesburg Christian Church. He only served a couple of years here and then moved on, but he was very instrumental in breaking the ice for full-time Christian ministry. Well, it was during his tenure here that something very important happened. There was an event that took place that kind of formulated and changed the shape of the future of Leesburg ministry. You see, years before this, there was a man by the name of Turney Collins, who was a member of this church. He was a farmer, and he passed away in 1961. And when he did, he deeded his property, which now is known as Leesburg Farms, which is approximately 80 acres directly behind the church, to the Leesburg Christian Church. He did that with the intent of that property being agriculturally used in order to help fund young men and women from the community to be able to pursue higher education. And so they would use the proceeds, and did do that for a number of years, to help some of the young boys, particularly in our community, be able to go and pursue education. So he gifted that property to the church. And the intent is that that would eventually become a resource center and a community gathering place to serve the area. But when the church fell on hard times, about 15 years after he had given this property to the church, they decided to do something. They were at a critical moment. They knew they needed to go into full-time Christian ministry, but they didn't have the resources or the funds to be able to do that. So they made a decision. The leadership of the church sold that property in order to be able to build a parsonage and to have the funds to begin a full-time ministry, which is what led to the hiring of Buford Cole in 1977 and the building of what we now have present as known as the parsonage that sits up on the hill directly at the rear of our property. So there was a lot of optimism about the ministry here, but unfortunately, like a lot of other ministries, it didn't last long. Typically, most churches have a history of its ups and downs, and Leesburg is no exception. There were a few splits and divisions over differences of opinion, but by the 1990s, the church had dwindled as a result of those fractions, and there were only a handful of members that were here. But then there was another key individual that was very instrumental in the turnaround of Leesburg Christian Church. His name is Mr. Dale Conrad. Dale Conrad has been a personal friend of mine for a number of years. I knew him when he first began his ministry here in the 80s, but then as the church dwindled and lost its momentum, they once again called Dale Conrad to come and serve them on the weekends and to help them to figure out what their next course of action should be. It was Dale Conrad that met with the church in 2001 and encouraged them to have a new vision, to pursue something different, to get back to full-time Christian ministry once again. It was Dale Conrad that encouraged them to contact myself at that time. And so once I was contacted, they invited me to come to this congregation and kind of serve as an interim and to help them decide which direction they needed to go. They either were going to step out on faith and move forward, or they were going to sell the property and give it to one of the local church camps or Christian universities. But Dale encouraged them to take a step of faith and to launch into full-time Christian ministry once again. So the handful of people that were here invited me, Sammy Harris, to come to this congregation to kind of serve as an interim. Dale encouraged the members to jump out on faith to try to pursue full-time ministry once again. Now, there were a lot of obstacles, as you can imagine. The building that was here, the 1888 building, was dilapidated. There certainly was no air conditioning. The furnace blew a lot of smoke when it was turned on. The building wasn't much, to say the least, but there was a lot of hope and optimism as what could be done in this area. After all, we have one of the largest plants in North America about 7 miles down the road, known as Toyota. Now, while the church was in search for its new identity, in February of 2002, there was a couple of dozen people that were still remaining here, and they began to meet and pray with Dale Conrad, and then I came on the scene and began to meet with them as well. And there were a few identifiable families that were very instrumental in those very first prayer meetings in 2002. Billy and Iris Worth, Tommy and Chiquita Power, Melissa Dyer, Barb and Larry Yearsley, Jeff and Debbie Brock, and then one of the men who was one of my most influential mentors, Beecher and Ruby Hines, were here praying and encouraging me in this ministry. So since that time, from 2002 to 2000 and wherever we are now, 20 years later plus, this congregation has really flourished based on what Jesus Christ had in store and the faith that those original people had in Him. We have been able to do numerous projects since that time and serve this community in ways that we could only dream about in those early stages. One of the very first projects that we had was remodeling the original sanctuary. The original sanctuary had not been refurbished in more than 50 years, and so there was a lot of work that needed to be done. We enclosed the picnic shelter that was here on the property from the 70s and made that a youth worship area. We built the worship center that I'm now standing in talking to you here at a original cost of $1.6 million, $300,000 of which was raised before the construction began. And right now, we are in the process of a new movement as far as our facility is concerned. We are building a family life center, which is the actual fulfillment of what Turney Collins' vision was many years ago when he deeded his property to this church. It was the idea that this would be a community center, a place where people in the community could gather and where young people could enjoy the fellowship in Christ at this location. So we're really excited as we get ready to complete. We're most of the way done with that project now, and through prayer and support, we'll be able to complete that very, very soon. Anyway, I hope that you enjoy a little bit of this history that we've shared with you. It is exciting because Leesburg is steeped in a lot of tradition and rich history, but you know what? I really believe that the best is yet to come. In the words of my friend Bob Russell, may those who come after us find us faithful. And may we look forward to what God has in store until He returns for us again someday.